warm welcome. Hello, everybody, to our second episode of our podcast series on Everyday Decoloniality, a multicultural initiative. And today, our topic of engagement is Islamic decoloniality and Islamophobia. And in this episode, we will be conversing with Shaheen K Moidunny, who is a research scholar in the School of Sociology and Social Research at the University of Leeds. Till date, he has spoken and written extensively on Islamophobia, Islamic decoloniality, and the subjugated state of Muslims in India. Today, in this episode, we will discuss about the ongoing problems of Islamophobia and the need to decolonize Islam with respect to the current experiences of Muslims in India. So, hello Shaheen, a warm welcome and thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Sayan. Happy to be with you.
Moving to our first question, I remember that a few weeks back when we were talking about the importance and the possibilities of doing research on Islam and Islamophobia, you were talking about Professor Salman Syed and his Critical Muslim Studies initiative, with which even you are associated as a part of your PhD. So can you elaborate on what Critical Muslim Studies is all about and what is its mission?
Okay, thank you, Sayan, for your question. And I would like to apologize in hand because I'm having a slight cold, so my voice is a bit strained. So the question on Critical Muslim Studies, what it's about. Now, what comes to mind actually is there was a book I read by Alistair Crook called Resistance, the Essence of the Islamist Revolution. In the introduction to his book, Alistair Crook details an absorbing conversation he had with a young Shiite scholar in the holy city of Qom in Iran. Now, while discussing the Western indisposition towards understanding the Iranian Revolution, 1979, the young Shi'i scholar pins down the Western predicament to its mode of thinking. And he sums it up quite neatly to Alistair Crook by stating that the core of the crisis lay not in the Western thinking per se, rather in how it thinks about thinking. So it is this crux that Critical Muslim Studies deals with. Now, as much of the narratives on Islam or Muslims are imagined from within a framework of modernity, coloniality, and in the case of India, you could say from a very secular, liberal, Brahminical framework or language. It requires us to challenge and undo many of the definitions, categories, and limits that dominate the contemporary narrative. Now, decoloniality claims to offer analytical tools and ideas to challenge this Eurocentrism in narratives. The Decolonial project, despite its growing acceptance as a counter-epistemic project, there is a certain blind spot when it comes to Islam, Muslims, or India and Dalits, for that instance, or any sorts of mobilization around Islam or a Dalit subject position. Now, for example, last year, 2018, saw actually two books on decoloniality. One was titled On Decoloniality by Walter Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, and the other one, The End of Cognitive Empire by De Souza Santos. Both are giants in the fields of decoloniality, and both those books are really good, well written, well argued, and it's a continuing contribution to decolonial thought. But again, as I said, there is this Muslim or Dalit blind spot in these books. So, for example, in the first one I mentioned, On Decoloniality by Mignolo and Catherine Walsh, in the introduction to the book, they make a list of 20 or so figures from the 20th century whom they feel or they imagine can be described as decolonial leaders or thinkers or personalities or decolonial figures. In that list of 20 or 30 personalities they mention, there's not a single Muslim in that. So not a single Muslim leader or scholar or activist or figure from the 20th century actually made it to the list compiled by Mignolo and Walsh in their book. The other book The End of Cognitive Empire by Santos. Again, in part of the book, he mentions, third part of the book is actually a chapter trying to place Gandhi as a decolonial figure. Now, this is not to deny Gandhi's contributions or relevance, or neither to provide fodder to Hindutva ideologues, but to provide space for Dalit agency. Now, I'm pretty sure that a Dalit academic or a Dalit activist in India would find placing Gandhi as a decolonial figure quite contentious. So it is these debates. It's not whether Gandhi is decolonial or not, but it is these debates that are missing in this sort of decolonial blind spot. Now, critical Muslim studies, as framed, as you said, by Professor Salman Saeed, who is also based at the University of Leeds, is not a methodology per se. Rather, it is to be understood as a way of viewing an approach, you could say a lens. And focus on matters of Muslims and Islam, or Islamic aid, in conversation on decolonial thought. The hallmark of critical Muslim studies is a rejection of Eurocentrism in different layers of epistemology, culture, and geopolitics. And it is characterized by a series of epistemological orientations, rejecting post-positivism, post-Orientalism, and decoloniality. Now, I'll just describe very briefly what these three orientations are. Now, positivism can be understood as a desire to produce a neutral, transparent, predictive knowledge that is supposed to have an independent validity. Now, a post-positivist approach rejects this essentialism, which, while attempting to be objective, locates interpretation external to its subject of study. So hence, and that also, in that way, a positivist approach also denies subjectivity as well. Now, in being post-positivist, critical Muslim studies attempts to challenge concepts, definitions, interpretations, and categories through which Islams and Muslims are understood. Now, Orientalism, as we are all aware, is marred by an essentialist understanding of Muslims and Islam. And hence, when we use the word post-Orientalism here, it is not just a mere critique of Orientalism, but it goes beyond the reductive understanding of Orientalism, constituting bias and prejudice. Now, post-Orientalism combines the strong and weak critiques of Orientalism. Now, weak Orientalism would approach Orientalism as an issue of sociology of knowledge, whereas a strong Orientalism is one in which Orientalism is responsible for the construction of the Orient itself and not mere a distortion. The Orient, as constituted by the Orientalist imagination, is in which the normality of the West resides. And the third orientation, of course, is decolonial thinking, which, according to Mignolo, is a call for epistemic delinking and epistemic disobedience. It recognizes the central role of Eurocentrism in knowledge production, tries to deconstruct and rewrite the history of Western hegemony. Now, having said all this, critical Muslim studies is not the application of decolonial theory with the figure of the Muslim replacing the wretched of the earth at the heart of its formulations. Rather, it is an engagement with some of the key concerns and responses of decolonial thinking. It is not a critique of Eurocentrism or positivism or Orientalism for the sake of critique. It can be most importantly understood as what to do after the critique. So it opens up the possibilities, not of a historical approach that is not just about remembering or restoring, but it is rather about reconceptualization, you could say, one that opens a decolonial horizon. Yeah, I hope that sort of briefly explains what critical Muslim studies is.
Okay, yes, that's wonderful, Shaheen, especially talking about it's not about replacement, but it's about developing a new horizon, reforming a new horizon. And as a little bit I have been observing about the various activities that are going with respect to critical Muslim studies. So various kind of engagements, like for instance, you have been organizing workshops and delivering lectures in India. We can also see a lot of young Muslims in India who are coming together and organizing well-constructed movements, especially against the current problems of mob lynchings and other forms of habitual subjugations that the Muslim community in India experience. So my point of interest here is what I really would like to know from you. So to what extent do you think that the framework or the various frameworks of critical Muslim studies can contribute towards improving the state of Muslims in contemporary India? And if you think that it has already been introduced, then what kind of changes it is really bringing in the existential situations of the Muslims?
Okay. It's a good question which would need some description, I think. And I think elements you could actually locate elements of this sort of thinking, what critical Muslim studies tries to do. You could find it among student movements in universities across India, which I'll come to later. Critical Muslim studies, if you look at the Indian scenario, it helps to undo or understand the narrative of Indian identity construction itself. So it helps to mount a critique of what is so-called fabric of secularism democracy that we see now in India from a Muslim subject position. Now, for instance, we could even problematize the language or the way the anti-fascist resistance is framed in India. I'm not talking about the BJP or the Sangh Parivar Hindutva as a whole, because I personally don't think that we need a lot of intellectual heavyweight lifting to actually tackle the BJP, which is quite evident. At the same time, the resistance that is mounted against the BJP or the anti-fascist Grand Alliance, you could say, also suffers from this sort of Muslim or Dalit blind spot. Now, for instance, the dominant anti-fascist narrative, or you could say discourse, frames the rise of Hindutva or right-wing Hindutva as an aberration constituting fascism, which is in turn is understood as symptomatic of corporate capitalism. Now, what critical Muslim studies can do in such a situation is that it can take the debate out of the parochial analysis of class, locating right-wing anti-Muslimness, thus opening up the debates for racialization and for a mobilization of Muslim political agency. Now, recently there was a write-up by a senior leftist-based academician from JNU, who actually wrote that Islamophobia is a phenomenon unique to the West, and in India just needs to be called an issue of communalism. Now, the entire argument mounted in that particular article is looking at the etymological definitions or the etymological underpinnings of the word Islamophobia rather than Islamophobia as a concept. We don't look at concepts looking at the constituent parts of the words in it. Rather, we look at how it is deployed. Now, Islamophobia is widely defined as a type of racism against Muslims or Muslimness. Now, this is a widely accepted definition that Islamophobia is a type of racism, or it is racism. It is accepted both in the academic and non-academic world. But unfortunately, the problem in Indian academia is that racism or racialization, for that sake, is largely ignored in academia. This is mainly due to the overarching presence of a left meta-narrative in Indian social sciences that hinge on class as an analytical tool to fathom India, or in this case, Muslims in India. Now, a good example would be the Sachar Committee report that came out in 2006. Now, the Sachar Committee report was tabled in 2006. The figures were shocking for everybody. Of course, people knew that situation was bad socioeconomically for Muslims. But when the Sachar Committee report came out, the figures were shocking that Muslims socioeconomically were one of the worst off in India. And also there was a study called the Intergenerational Mobility in India, which concluded that in terms of educational mobility, Indian Muslims are worse off than African Americans in the US today. Now, all analysis of the Sachar Committee report after the last 13 years have been attributed to either misgovernance or a lack of will or corruption. It is not seen as systemic or institutional racism or a form of violence. Again, violence against Muslims is only understood as corporeal violence, not as systemic or institutional. You wouldn't find this analysis in academia. It's either misgovernance or corruption or a lack of will that led to the state of Muslims in the last 60 years in India. Now, and this is the way this is the way that even the language of anti-Hindutva resistance is formulated in India. And this actually leads to a denial or erasure of Muslim agency. Now, one more example I could say is that last year, a senior advocate and activist in the Supreme Court, she stated that she submitted a petition to the Supreme Court, 84-page writ petition, demanding an anti-lynching law in India. An anti-lynching law to be legislated to protect Muslim minorities. It was in good faith. But again, and in that writ petition, she draws the parallels between lynchings of African Americans in the late 19th century during the advent of the Jim Crow laws, and argues that lynchings and mob violence in India specifically target Muslims. So there's a parallel being drawn in that petition of comparing the African American lynching in the US and Muslim lynchings again in India. Now the problem with that narrative is that it stops the comparison between African Americans and Muslims in India, African Americans in the US and Muslims in India. The comparison stops at the victimization, not more than that. Now the very fact that African Americans in the US, they organized around their identity, they mobilized, and they produced leaders like Malcolm X and Martin Luther. This trajectory is not followed here, or it is not allowed to be followed. So in that way, an Indian Muslim version of Malcolm X or Martin Luther would simply not happen. If they were to rise, they would be subjected or categorized as being communal. So again, you see a very positivist narrative of communalism. You would see that this epistemological position of communalism, which is ascribed to a secular narrative, cedes the moral high ground by equating violence with the general category of religion, irrespective of the existing stark asymmetry between the religious groups and the violence and the empirical data behind that. So by deploying concepts like communalism or communal violence without specifying anybody or an identity to depict anti-Muslim violence, not only lays the equal blame on the victim and the perpetrator alike, despite the evidence to the contrary. And I would just like to explain one more thing in this. Now, even the word fascism that is used to explain the phenomena that is going on in India, and we call it the anti-fascist alliance, so we try to explain what is going on in India, we try to mark the right-wing groups in India by the word fascism. The fascism is a very Eurocentric, again, conceptualization. Now, the definition used to understand fascism is one provided by Georgy Dimitrov, a Bulgarian international communist, back in 1935. Now, most Indian leaders, including leaders from the left, they try to use or they frame this particular definition. Sitaram Yechuri, in one of his talks and a long article that came out in the that is their own line, he uses this very definition and underpins it by saying this is the most apt definition for understanding what fascism is. And so it is the definition is that fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of finance capital. So essentially what they're saying is that fascism is bad capitalism. That's it. Now, the victims or the targets of the BJP, RSS, and the Hindutva are basically Dalits and Muslims primarily. Dalits for appropriation, Dalits and Muslims for both appropriation and annihilation. So what is being failed here to be done is that there is no attempt to ascertain how these groups understand this phenomenon, or they understand fascism, or understand the BJP, the phenomena, what like describe it. So they would like to describe it in just terms of class or capital or bad capitalism. Now, even if you use simple logic, the word fascism was that Benito Mussolini himself used to describe his beliefs and views. The same way, Hitler used to describe his beliefs and views as Nazism. And the same way, you could compare that simple logic and use that Veera Savarkar popularized the term Hindutva to describe what the BJP and the RSS is. And the BJP adopted it in 1989 as part of its ideology. So you could see sometimes you'd see Dalit scholars and they actually not using the word fascism, rather they would use the word Brahmanical supremacy. Now, the aim is not to find a perfect answer or perfect terminology to mark the BJP or the RSS or Sangh Parivar Hindutva. But the attempt is to project a new way of thinking or a new language of articulating. As this critique I make of the left is not a critique about, as I said in the beginning, of what they think, but rather a critique about what they think about thinking. So I think that answers your question.
Yes, and also when I was listening to the various political and the ideological perspectives that you were talking about, I was also wondering that this has altogether made this Islam is very much synonymous to dehumanization and terror. Because what we see across the world today is that Muslims, how they are being stereotyped through misinterpretation of the Holy Quran, through their physical appearances, through their languages, through their geographical belongingness, culinary practices, institutional affiliations, and the list moves on. So my point here is that what counter efforts are being undertaken to dismantle this dehumanized portrayal of Muslims across the globe? And also, can you elaborate on some of the prominent initiatives that are being undertaken within academic and non-academic spaces?
Okay, sure. Now, one of the ways, as you described in your question, that Muslims are being stereotyped through appearances, languages, geographical belongingness, even culinary practices. So what we see is a shift of, although we would say essentially when we use the word, one of the arguments against Islamophobia as racism is that Muslims are not a race. Now that actually reflects a very naive understanding or a very outdated understanding of what race is. Now scientifically, there's nothing called race. It doesn't exist. There's nothing called race. At the same time, although there's nothing called race, people can be acted upon or treated like a race. Now, Muslims, irrespective of where they're from, now, if you're Muslim from India, you're a Muslim from the West, you're a Muslim from Africa, you're a Muslim from Southeast Asia, wherever you're from, you would be subject to the same way of treatment when you go through an airport in the US. Or you would have the same type of people, even in India, a Muslim from Kerala, or a Muslim from Delhi, or a Muslim from Assam, would be subject to the same kind of violence in the name of his culinary practice. So Muslims are being treated like a race. So Muslims are being racialized. Hence the idea of introducing racism into the discourse on Muslims in India. Now, in the UK, recently, the all-party parliamentary group of British Muslims in the UK, they adopted a definition of Islamophobia as racism. And it was backed by 300 academics and the Muslim community at large. Now, critical Muslim studies, and this definition actually came out from this idea of critical Muslim studies. The definition also was formulated by Salman Saeed himself. Now, in the attempts to actually put these initiatives into place, critical Muslim studies has been going on for at least 5 years now. There is a blog, Reorient, there's a peer-reviewed academic journal that comes from this framework, and there have been various workshops and conferences held. There is going to be an international conference next year, University of Leeds, next October most probably. Now, back in India, now it is quite interesting to see that India, in the discourse on decoloniality, one of the groups whom I know, that Student Islamic Organization, they organized a conference on decolonial thinking back in 2015 and Islamic decoloniality. So they did bring in decolonial figures like Professor Farid Isaaq from South Africa and Dr. Syed Mustafa Ali from London. Later, the very next year, they again brought Professor Ramon Grossfugel and Dr. Hatim Bazian from the University of California, Berkeley. So you see these sort of initiatives taking place even among Indian Muslims as well. And their books, articles have been translated in local languages, in Urdu, in Malayalam, at least I know of. There might be in other languages as well. And for example, there is now an ongoing event in Kerala that I know of called the Festival of Ideas and Resistance. That is again a series of talks and seminars all over the month till December, on certain topics of nationalism. So they all try to look at these issues from this approach. Now, in the non-academic space, I mean, in the space of activism, you could notice a huge surge in the number of Dalit and Muslim students taking up such lines of research and arguments in the central universities of India. And this represents a radical shift in Indian universities and Indian academia. Unlike the comfort enjoyed in Western academic spaces like researchers like me, we'll actually do research in comfort here. The experience for these student scholars, some of whom I know personally, has not been easygoing. They have been subjected to institutional exclusion and harassment in taking up such lines of argument. And an example is the case of the death of Rohit Vemula and the resulting mobilizations that happened in Hyderabad. Despite these, we see the student mobilizations of coalitions emanating from a Dalit Muslim episteme in the central universities in Hyderabad, Delhi, or Kerala, for instance. There was the elections in Hyderabad and in JNU where you had a Dalit Muslim coalition taking part in it. So the issues they raise and the language they frame these issues is something that is new and that is not confined to a right or left binary. But this doesn't mean that, or we shouldn't assume that this is a third alternative or a center position between right and left. But rather it is a position that transcends the entire foundation that these binaries are based upon. So I think I answered your question in this way.
Yes, that's really encouraging, because usually what happens, talking about decoloniality in general, in India till date, what I have found is that there are engagements going here and there, some of the engagements you have already mentioned. But at the end of the day, it is in a very scattered state. At least what we see in UK or in any other, like for example, in parts of South Africa and UK and several other parts of the world, where decolonial engagements are very regular. In that, compared to that in India, still I find it's in a very scattered and a confused state. But still, it's really encouraging to see how the initiatives are being undertaken. And most importantly, in Kerala, we see that translation works are also going on. Decolonial engagements are taking place in the local native language, which is another very important thing to actually get the common people into the framework, and also to go beyond the academic spaces. So with this, I think we will come to the end to this very interesting podcast, and thank you, Shaheen, once again for your amazing reflections.
Thank you, Sayan. It was an honor being on the podcast. Thank you.